The last site that my group visited on the excursion at the World Neolithic Congress was the site of Karahan Tepe. Now, I'd been really excited about this site for quite a long time because, in my view, it can help to answer a lot of the questions that are still unresolved about Göbekli Tepe. And I was very, very excited when Neshmi Karel began doing excavations there a few years ago. But I had no idea how much progress they'd made in those excavations since the last time I saw any reports on it. So we were very excited to see those. The sun was dropping fast as we wrapped up our visit to Sefer Tepe, and I, for one, was a bit worried about whether we'd have enough light by the time we got to Karahan Tepe. Fortunately, the two sites are only about 20 kilometers apart, although it was more like 35 kilometers by road. This is a site in the Tek Mountains that has been known since 1997, but large-scale excavations under the direction of Professor Dr. Neshmi Karel of Istanbul University only began in 2019, with some interruption during the COVID pandemic. The bus is parked near the small rest house at the foot of the site, and I just about raced up to the gate. From there, there's a path and a stone stairway, presumably built from stones removed during the excavations, that leads up to some exposed bedrock features at the north end of the excavations. I climbed that path as fast as I could. Immediately east of this is structure AC, with not much preserved except for its bedrock floor with some grooves and depressions cut into it. Opposite the bare bedrock, a boardwalk leads past the bedrock hollow called structure AA, a fairly large and flat depression in the bedrock with a much deeper, irregular pit near its center. In this picture, taken at a different time of year, there is still water collected in that deep pit. It also has a kind of shelf around its southwestern side, and a pair of enigmatic hollows at the northern end of that shelf. Beyond, the boardwalk leads to the very unusual feature that the excavators designated as structure AB. I have to say that this feature is a lot bigger and deeper than I had imagined from the photos I'd seen previously. It's about 7 meters in length and almost 2 meters deep. Neolithic workers had excavated it down into the bedrock in such a way as to leave 10 rather phallic-looking pillars, and there's an 11th flat pillar that is quite different in shape, perhaps representing a rearing snake, and installed in it rather than carved from the bedrock. The tops of most of the pillars are almost level, and there are a couple of slots in the west wall, also at that level and just right of a sculpted face. This suggests to me that there was once a wooden floor that these pillars supported. A sort of ridge or shelf that's on the east and west sides, also on a level with the tops of most of the pillars, would be consistent with that. I also notice a strange feature, kind of like two hollows with a shallow channel between them, on the top of the eastern wall of structure AB. Professor Karel interprets this as a ritual feature, perhaps a sort of initiation chamber adjacent to the large oval building AD to its south. However, there's also a serpentine channel leading into it on the north side, apparently to direct rainwater into it, and it strikes me as likely that structure AB is a very large cistern, which I don't see as incompatible with all the symbolism that's clearly there, particularly given how important water would have been to the site's inhabitants. Incidentally, it would make sense to cover a cistern with a floor or a roof to reduce evaporation. It also makes sense that feature AA, just upstream from AB, also has characteristics pointing to the possibility that it was a cistern, or perhaps a settling tank to ensure that the water flowing into AD would have less sediment in it. Reportedly, the bottom half meter or so of structure AB was filled with a reddish deposit containing small and medium-sized stones, but no artifacts. On top of this was a dark deposit containing stones and artifacts, including occasional pottery sherds. Since Karahan Tepe dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic, that might sound strange, but in fact very small amounts of pottery do sometimes occur in sites of the pre-pottery Neolithic B. For example, a very few sherds occurred within PPNB walls at the site of Ain Ghazal in Jordan. I know this because I excavated them myself. The difference is that in pre-pottery Neolithic B, pottery was rare, crude, and kind of experimental, often consisting of miniature vessels. In fact, Dr. Karel's team has also found miniature vessels at Karahan Tepe. By contrast, there was an explosion of pottery making at the beginning of the so-called pottery Neolithic, which started not long after 7000 BC in southern Turkey and northern Syria, but only around 6400 BC in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And that pottery was also of a much more competent manufacture than anything you'd find in a PPNB site. I'd be interested to know whether the reddish deposit without artifacts that occupied the bottom of this possible cistern was alluvial in origin, resulting from particles settling in water. I hope somebody saved samples of the sediment for geological analysis. They might even contain diatoms, microscopic fossils of algae that live in almost any aquatic environment. However, Dr. Caro believes that structure AB was intentionally filled in and finally covered over with stone slabs. His argument for that seems pretty compelling, at least for the upper deposits. I'm not so sure about that lowest deposit, however, which seems to have been very different from the darker deposit above it. After looking at these possible water features, I walked a few meters farther south to overlook the large oval structure, building AD, some 23 meters in diameter. Like the big ones at Göbekli Tepe, its floor is cut into the bedrock, and in this case the surrounding benches on the western and southwestern sides, along with some buttresses, are also cut from the bedrock, much as at the site of Sayburj that I described in a previous video, except with a sort of step in it. Because the bedrock slopes downward to the east, the benches on the eastern side are completed with slabs of stone. The walls on the western side are preserved to a height of 4.3 meters above the floor. There's an opening in the wall here that links AD to the phallus pillar building AB. Professor Carl interprets this as a sort of doorway for rituals that would involve crawling into or out of that neighboring chamber. On the other hand, it could also just be to give access to water collected there, and a pit dug into the floor nearby would collect any overflow from the cistern. Despite the obvious similarities to Göbekli Tepe, the one major difference is that the large limestone pillars here are in much worse condition. The two central pillars have been toppled and smashed, presumably thousands of years ago, before the room became buried. In addition, some stone slabs incorporated into the peripheral benches appear to be recycled pillars. One of these has an edge relief that seems to represent a leopard pelt, with the leopard's spots clearly indicated. Notably, Professor Caro argues that the fill in this building was also intentional. He calls attention to the way the deposits slope in the stratigraphic section they documented before excavating the south half of the building. There's no question that they slope downward from the western side. However, that would also happen if the fill resulted from erosion of the slope above the building. And I have to say, I don't see anything in this section that looks like individual basket loads of earth. If anything, the size sorting of rocks looks more to me like what you'd expect in a colluvial deposit. I think it would be a good idea for a geomorphologist to examine the sediments here to settle this important question. After I left building AD by retracing my steps along the boardwalk, I headed upslope toward the west. Just above structures AA and AB, there was exposed bedrock with large cut marks and a deep hollow, perhaps another kind of cistern. I then walked around the excavations, more or less counterclockwise, and rather quickly, as the sun was already getting quite low. My first impression was surprise, almost shock really, at how much more was now excavated here than in the recent publications I'd seen. Carl's team has not only opened up a great deal more area over the last year or two, they've excavated down to the floors of buildings that are well over 2 meters below the modern surface. They have moved an incredible amount of dirt in this short time, considering that it all has to be excavated by hand and with care not to damage anything or overlook any important evidence. Not far west and upslope of the famous phallus pillar structure, there are some rectangular buildings of various sizes, probably pre-pottery Neolithic B in date, and certainly later than the large building AD. As at Göbekli Tepe, rectangular buildings appear to have replaced round ones over time. Above those, we come to a nearly rectangular building, about 15 meters in length, on the western edge of the current excavated area. Two very large but highly fractured central pillars have fallen here, and if you look closely, you can see that they toppled after some dark sediment, probably rich in organic remains, then a slightly thicker layer of lighter sediment had accumulated on what appears to be a bedrock floor. This probably indicates that they toppled during the Neolithic, but only after a long period of existence, and prior to the much rockier deposits higher up. Like the earlier large round buildings, it has peripheral benches with smaller pillars set into or onto them. But the most remarkable aspect of this building is what's along its north wall. One of those so-called portal stones, or at least a large disc-shaped stone with a large central hole, is set into the north wall and framed by two pillars. Some stone dishes had been left on the platform in front of this holed stone, as well as on the floor. When excavated, the statue of a vulture was found set into the right side of the platform, but it has been removed to the Şanlı Archaeological Museum. I imagine they'll eventually install a replica one here. To the east of the right pillar is a monumental statue of a seated man, almost 2.5 meters high. He looks rather skeletal, with ribs prominent, and he's holding his penis, recalling the pose of the figure in that bench at Seburg. One possible interpretation of this is that he represents the ancestor of a lineage, the visible ribs signaling that he's deceased, and the penis emphasizing that he was a progenitor of his lineage. East of this building is a rectangular one with benches made from large stone slabs. It has one large pillar exposed, its top missing, and it's possible that there's a second one still buried in the unexcavated southern part of this room. Continuing toward the east, there are two more fairly large buildings, one square and the other one almost hexagonal. These have flagstone floors made from large flat slabs, and the southernmost one has peripheral benches with steps that also appear to be made of stone slabs. Again, it seems likely that these are later in date than the very large building AD to their north. Here, again, the limestone pillars are in very poor condition. An interesting feature is the small so-called portal stone set into the wall in the northern or northeastern corner, just slightly above the level of the bench. There's also a sort of niche in the wall just to its left. Next to the path along the south edge of the excavations, and here and there elsewhere, I noticed several large broken portal stones. From here, you also get a good view of the southern slopes and the valley beyond, where apparently there are also buried buildings. You can see the tops of a few pillars in places along the upper slope. In the southeastern corner of the excavation area, the upper parts of pillars have been exposed, but the excavators have yet to remove the rocky fill down to the floors. Most of the pillars here are still erect, but a couple have fallen over. While preservation conditions have not been kind to pillars at Karahan Tepe, some of them do show signs of decoration. Interestingly, engraved images seem to be at least as common as the shallow reliefs that dominate the decorated pillars at Göbekli Tepe. These are incised outlines of animals, and some, like this one, that appear more geometrical, or at least more difficult to decipher. However, there are also relief decorations at the site, including images of snakes, a type of imagery that's also common at Göbekli Tepe. An exciting recent discovery was a graffito of a running onager, or wild donkey, on a flagstone that was part of the floor in one of the houses at the site. While we can't be sure how every building at the site was used, quite a few of them were clearly domestic residences. They show lots of grinding stones, stone vessels, and other artifacts that would have been used for food preparation. Some of them are oval or irregular in shape, while others, presumably later in date, are rectangular, often with 2 or 4 pillars. As I walked northward along the east edge of the excavations, I finally reached what for me was the highlight of this site visit. This is a fairly large, sub-rectangular building, maybe 15 meters long, immediately east and downslope from building AD. It also has a bedrock floor, but also some very surprising features. The bench on the northern side is covered with stacks of stone vessels, both pots and platters, and the floor to its south shows a stone-lined hearth area and what appear to be charred or ashy patches. The team member standing in the building told us that this burned-looking area was rich in animal bone fragments. Most importantly, the south wall, behind him, has 2 large ovens in it, the one at left still filled with sediment. In fact, it looks to me as though a lot of that burn material on the floor in front of that oven is likely from cleaning out the ash and charcoal from the oven. Professor Karl and his colleagues say that these ovens are much too large to have been for ordinary domestic use. However, I have to say that the ovens I saw attached to the outer walls of village houses in the modern village of Seeburg earlier in the day were almost as large as these ones, even though those ones are presumably used only to bake bread and other foods for single families. The number of well-made stone vessels in this room, both on the bench and elsewhere, is almost staggering, and quite a few more from the site are now in the Şanlı Archaeological Museum. Some of them are finely decorated with incised designs. Why these were just left here like this is something of a mystery. Perhaps, as Professor Karl argues, they were part of a ritual infilling of the building when it went out of use. Overall, whether this fascinating building is a communal building where people prepared celebratory feasts, the house of an important and prestigious household, or something else, it seems unquestionable that a lot of cooking activity took place in it. Incidentally, I should mention that, as at all early Neolithic sites in the region, the animal bones found at this site and in this building all come from wild animals. Here they include gazelles, onagers or wild donkeys, sheep, goats, wild boar, and oxen, although I think that I've heard that they've also found leopard bones at the site. By this time, the sun was just about to set, and we headed back to the buses to return to our hotels. To our surprise, the buses first stopped at the Neolithic site of Göbekli Tepe, south of Urfa, but it was too dark by that time for us to see anything. In any case, I was happy to have Karahan Tepe as the climax of my day.